Imagine being left on a strip of sand barely a mile long in the middle of the Indian Ocean, with no trees, no fresh water, no tools, and only the broken bones of a sunken ship around you. Imagine watching the boat that could have saved you disappear over the horizon, carrying the very people who promised they would come back. Now imagine that no one came, not for a week, not for a month, not for a year. For 15 long, brutal years, the world moved on, fought wars, made fortunes, and forgot that you ever existed. That is not a nightmare pulled from fiction. That is the true and largely untold story of the people abandoned on Tromelin Island, and it remains one of the most extraordinary accounts of human survival and institutional abandonment in recorded history. In the summer of 1761, a French ship called L'Outil set sail across the Indian Ocean carrying a deadly secret in its cargo hold. The vessel was operated by the French East India Company and was officially bound for the island of Mauritius, then known as Isle de France. But its captain, Jean de Lafargue, had made a side arrangement that violated direct orders from colonial authorities. He had stopped in Madagascar and taken on board more than 160 enslaved Malagasy people, men, women, and children, intending to sell them in Mauritius despite a standing prohibition against such trade on the island. The human beings packed into the lower decks were not considered passengers in any meaningful sense of the word. They were treated as cargo, locked below and given minimal food and water, as the ship pressed eastward through unpredictable waters. Their names were not recorded in any official log. Their faces were not painted in any portrait. To the colonial empire that authorized and profited from their suffering, they were numbers on a ledger and nothing more. What Lafargue did not fully account for was the treachery of the Indian Ocean itself. The navigational charts available to the crew were outdated, incomplete, and often contradicted one another. On the night of July 31st, 1761, L'Outil struck the coral reefs surrounding a tiny, flat, nearly featureless sandbar that sailors had rarely marked on any map. The impact was catastrophic. The hull splintered within minutes, and the sea poured in with merciless speed. Most of the enslaved Malagasy, locked below deck and unable to escape, drowned before they could even comprehend what was happening. By the time the sun rose on August 1st, the survivors were standing on a strip of sand that offered almost nothing. Around 122 French crew members and between 60 and 80 Malagasy slaves had made it to shore. They were stranded on what was then called Île des Sables, the Island of Sand, a name that described it perfectly. No shade, no vegetation worth speaking of, no natural source of fresh water anywhere on its surface. The days immediately following the wreck were defined by raw survival instinct and the earliest signs of what would become a deeply unjust separation. Captain Lafargue reportedly suffered some kind of mental collapse in the wake of the disaster, and command passed to his first officer, Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet. Castellan was a man of some organizational ability, and he directed the survivors to salvage everything they could from the wreckage. A well was dug painstakingly over several days until fresh water was found. A forge and an oven were constructed from salvaged metal and stone. Separate camps were built, one for the French crew and one for the Malagasy captives, a partition that spoke volumes about who still controlled the situation, even after a catastrophe had made them nominally equal. The enslaved people, who had already survived the wreck against nearly impossible odds, worked alongside the French in salvaging materials, building shelters, and gathering food from the sea. Turtles were hunted on the shore, fish were caught, seabirds were taken from the sky. Within 2 months, the crew had used the remains of L'Utile to construct a new vessel. They called it La Providence, and it was just large enough to carry the French survivors back toward civilization. The date was September 27, 1761, and as Castellan prepared to board the makeshift boat with 122 of his men, he stood before the Malagasy survivors and made a promise. Help would come. A ship would be sent. They would not be forgotten. He may have genuinely believed those words at the time. He may have felt the weight of them as the boat pushed off from the shore and the figures on the beach grew smaller and then disappeared. What followed, however, was 15 years of broken silence, bureaucratic indifference, political distraction, and the grinding machinery of an empire that had simply decided some lives were not worth the cost of a rescue mission. The Providence reached Madagascar in just over 4 days. The crew was transferred to Tromelin Island and then to Mauritius. When they arrived, Castellan faced a furious colonial governor who was outraged not by the abandonment of the Malagasy people, but by the illegal slave trading that had caused the shipwreck in the first place. Castellan reportedly requested almost immediately that a ship be sent back to the island to rescue the survivors. The request was denied. He requested again, denied again. News of the stranded captives eventually filtered back to Paris and caused a brief stir in intellectual circles, but the 7 Years' War was consuming Europe's attention, and the French East India Company was lurching toward bankruptcy. The Malagasy people on Ile de Sable fell out of the conversation as quickly as they had entered it. Castellan continued to petition the naval ministry for 11 years before he received even a tentative commitment to send a rescue vessel, and it would be another 3 years after that before any ship actually attempted to reach the island. On Ile de Sable itself, the survivors had no choice but to build a life out of almost nothing. Archaeologists who excavated the island in a series of expeditions beginning in 2006 have since uncovered remarkable evidence of what those 15 years actually looked like. The survivors constructed shelters from coral blocks cut from the reef, building walls thick enough to withstand the cyclones that routinely swept across the island. They maintained a communal kitchen where copper pots, repaired again and again with whatever metal was available, were used to cook food. They fashioned tools from the scraps of the shipwreck. They made clothing and blankets by plucking the wings of seabirds and weaving the feathers together. They kept a fire burning, sustained by driftwood and the last fragments of the original wreck. And not fire became both a practical necessity and a symbol of their refusal to give up. The archaeological evidence suggests that the survivors organized themselves with extraordinary discipline, maintaining a community structure that allowed them to endure years of isolation that would have broken almost anyone. The failed rescue attempts that came eventually were almost crueler than the original abandonment. In 1773, a ship passed close enough to the island to spot it and report the survivors to colonial authorities. A vessel was sent, but the powerful reefs and unpredictable currents surrounding the island made landing impossible. A second attempt by a ship called La Sauterelle in 1775 ended with a rescue boat smashed against the reef. One sailor managed to swim to safety aboard his ship. The other swam toward the island instead and ended up stranded alongside the very people he had been sent to save. He eventually built a raft with 3 Malagasy men and 3 women and attempted to sail away. They were never seen again. 2 more ships tried in the years that followed and failed to make contact. Each of these attempts must have been an almost unbearable experience for the survivors watching from the shore, seeing ships appear on the horizon only to turn away again, their signals unacknowledged, their voices unheard across the crashing surf. It was not until November 29th, 1776, 15 years and 4 months after Luteil struck the reef, that a French naval officer named Jacques-Marie Boudin de Tromelin successfully landed on the island. What he found there defied the expectations of everyone who had assumed no one could possibly still be alive. 7 women remained, and 1 child, a boy 8 months old who had been born on the island, the only home he had ever known. The women were dressed in garments they had made from bird feathers. They were thin, weathered by years of sun and wind and cyclones, but they were alive, and they were standing. A fire that had been burning for 15 years still glowed in the remnants of their communal shelter. Tromelin brought them aboard La Dauphine and sailed for Mauritius, where the colonial governor declared them free. The island was renamed in the naval officer's honor, a geographical footnote that carries in its syllables the entire weight of a story that nearly vanished from history altogether. What happened to those 7 women and the child after they reached Mauritius is largely unknown. The records that might have followed their lives simply do not exist. A silence that reflects the broader pattern of how colonialism treated the people it consumed. One family group, a grandmother, her daughter, and the infant, was reportedly taken in by the governor himself, who gave the child the name Jacques Moise, the French form of Moses, a baby rescued from the water. It is a detail so precisely resonant with the story's weight that it almost seems invented, and yet it appears in the historical record as fact. The other women dissolved into the community of freed people in Mauritius, and their descendants, if they survived, are almost certainly living somewhere in the world today, unaware of the extraordinary thread of survival that connects them to a tiny, windswept island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The story of Tromelin Island is not merely a tale of survival. It is a mirror held up to an era that valued profit over people, and a reminder that the most astonishing acts of human endurance are often the ones that history tries hardest to forget.